Before 1901, there was no such thing as Australia. Not really. Sure, there was a continent inhabited for over 60,000 years by the world's oldest living cultures, but the continent that European settlers had colonized wasn't one country. It was 6 separate self-governing British colonies, 6 rivals, acting more like feuding siblings than a unified family. You had New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, and Western Australia. Each had its own government, its own laws, its own postage stamps, and even its own little military force. They were, for all practical purposes, 6 different countries just happening to share the same landmass. And this single fact created a reality so absurd, so inefficient, and so frustrating that it would force these bickering rivals into a decision that would change the continent's history forever, a decision to become one nation. But this act of creation, born from a mix of common sense, fear, and a new kind of national pride, would cast long shadows, forging a new identity while creating unforeseen conflicts that still shape the country today. Imagine you're trying to travel from Sydney to Melbourne in the late 1800s. You board a train, you settle in, but when you reach the border at Albury, everything just stops. Everyone has to get off the train, drag all their luggage across the platform, and get onto a completely different train waiting on the other side, not because of a breakdown but by design. This was the ridiculous reality for Australians. See, the colony of New South Wales built its railways with one size track, the standard gauge. Victoria built its with another, a broad gauge. Queensland and Western Australia, they used a narrow gauge. It was chaos. This one deeply frustrating problem was a perfect symbol of a much deeper continent carved up by invisible lines and colonial pride, and fixing it would require something much bigger than just standardizing some tracks. It would require building a nation. That railway mess was just the most obvious sign of a deeply fractured continent. To get why federation became not just a good idea, but an absolute necessity, you have to understand the daily frustrations that defined life in the colonies. They weren't just separated by geography. They were separated by suspicion, competition, and cold, hard cash. This was glaringly obvious in their trade policies. Imagine trying to run a business. Let's say you're a farmer in New South Wales, right near the Murray River, and you want to sell your wheat to a town just across the water in Victoria. To do that, you'd have to pay a tariff to the Victorian government. Every single bag of wheat, every bale of wool, every crate of fruit that crossed a colonial border got taxed. It was like trying to send a package from Texas to Oklahoma and having to pay an international customs fee. These tariffs were a huge source of income for the colonial governments, but they strangled the economy. A manufacturer in Adelaide might find it cheaper to import goods all the way from Britain than from just next door in Melbourne. It created absurd situations where goods would travel up and down the Murray and Darling rivers, navigating a confusing and expensive maze of customs posts. This constant economic friction created a lot of resentment and made a mockery of the idea that they were all part of the same British Empire. It was crystal clear to business owners and forward thinkers. A single Australian market, free of internal borders, would be way more efficient and prosperous for everyone. But the divisions went deeper than money. They went to the fundamental question of security. Each of the 6 colonies had its own small, independent military. Victoria had a small navy, New South Wales had its own regiments, and so on. They were fine for local defense, but what would happen if a major foreign power decided to threaten the continent? In the late 19th century, this wasn't some paranoid fantasy. Other European powers were scrambling for territory in the Pacific. Germany had annexed parts of New Guinea. France was active in New Caledonia. There was a growing fear that Australia, with its huge, sparsely populated coastline and patchwork of tiny, uncoordinated armies, was a sitting duck. A single colony couldn't possibly defend itself against a modern navy. How could 6 separate forces, with 6 different bosses, ever coordinate to protect an entire continent? The argument was simple and powerful. Australia needed one military, a national defense force under a single federal command. Beyond the practical problems of trains, taxes, and troops, something more subtle was happening. The birth of a new identity. By the 1890s, more than 3/4 of the non-Indigenous population had been born in Australia. A generation was coming of age that felt a connection not just to Victoria or Queensland, but to the continent itself. They shared a language and heritage, sure, but also a distinct experience forged in the Australian landscape. This new identity found its voice in the poems of Banjo Paterson and Henry Lawson, and in the art of the Heidelberg School. It was forged in the fierce rivalries of when colonial soldiers went to fight for the empire in the Boer War in South Africa in 18. They served together as Australians, and yet there was no Australia on the map to give this feeling a political home. They were still officially Victorians, Queenslanders, and Tasmanians, British subjects living in a collection of colonies. The New South Wales Premier, Sir Henry Parkes, a man who had become known as the father of federation, famously spoke of the crimson thread of kinship that tied them all together. There was a growing hunger for that thread to be woven into the fabric of a new nation. These four pressures: the railway chaos, the economic poison of tariffs, the fear of foreign threats, and the pull of a new Australian identity, created a powerful current pushing the colonies towards a single, audacious goal: federation. The question was no longer if they should unite, but how. The journey from a continent of rivals to a single nation wasn't a straight line. It was a long, messy, and difficult process, full of fiery speeches, backroom deals, and moments where the whole thing was on the brink of collapse. The first big spark came on October 24, 1889. Sir Henry Parkes, the long-serving and rather dramatic Premier of New South Wales, travelled to the small country town of There, in what became known as the Tenterfield Oration, he laid out a clear, urgent case for unification. He argued that the colonies needed a central government and a national parliament to handle their shared interests, especially defense. Parkes's speech gave the federation movement the political kickstart it desperately needed. Riding that wave, leaders from all 6 colonies, and even New Zealand, gathered for a convention in Sydney in 1891 to draft a constitution for a new Commonwealth of Australia. For weeks they debated the very architecture of the new nation. How could they possibly balance the power between the big, populous colonies like New South Wales and Victoria, and the smaller ones like Tasmania and South Australia? They looked to Britain and the United States for ideas. From the British, they took the model of a prime minister and cabinet who answered to the parliament. From the Americans, they took the idea of a federation, where powers are split between a central government and the states. They also adopted the idea of a two-house parliament, a House of Representatives, where seats were based on population, and a Senate where every state got the same number of senators, no matter its size. This was the Great Compromise, designed to stop the smaller states from being bullied by the bigger ones. After weeks of arguing, they produced a draft constitution. It was a remarkable achievement. And then it all just sort of fizzled out. Just as federation seemed within reach, Australia was slammed by a devastating economic depression in the early 1890s. Banks collapsed, businesses failed, and unemployment shot through the roof. Suddenly, the grand idea of creating a new nation seemed like an expensive distraction. People were more worried about feeding their families than debating constitutions. The colonial parliaments, facing their own crises, pushed federation onto the back burner. There was also plenty of opposition. Some folks in the smaller colonies worried they'd be swallowed whole, their local interests steamrolled by Sydney and Melbourne. Labor unions worried that federation would be used to import cheap foreign labor, driving down wages for Australian workers. And some people were just perfectly happy being Victorians or Tasmanians, and saw no reason to change. For a few years it looked like the dream of a united Australia was dead. But the idea just wouldn't die. Grassroots groups like the Australian Natives Association, which was made up of Australian-born white men, kept the flame alive. They organized people's conferences in towns like Corowa and Bathurst, pushing the politicians to get back to the negotiating table. It worked. A second series of constitutional conventions was held between 1897 and 1898. The delegates were elected directly by the people, which gave the whole process a new democratic energy. They dusted off the 1891 draft and spent months hammering out the details in Adelaide, Sydney, and Melbourne. With a final constitution ready, it was time for the ultimate test, a public vote. In 1898, referendums were held in Victoria, South Australia, and Tasmania, and all of them passed with a big yes. But in New South Wales, the biggest colony of all, the result was a bitter disappointment. A majority actually voted in favour, but it didn't reach the higher target number of yes votes that its own parliament had demanded. The whole project was, once again, about to fall apart. In a last-ditch effort, the colonial premiers held a secret meeting in January 1899 to thrash out a deal. They made some key concessions to get New South Wales on board. The biggest one, an agreement that the new national capital would be located inside NF, but at least 100 miles from Sydney, a clever compromise that would eventually give us Canberra. With these changes made, a second round of referendums was held. This time, New South Wales voted yes decisively. Queensland and South Australia followed. The only holdout was Western Australia, which was isolated and worried about losing its tariff money, but facing the prospect of being left out in the cold and with huge pressure from its goldfields population, many of whom were newcomers from the eastern colonies who finally held a referendum in 1900. It passed. The path was clear. A delegation of Australian leaders sailed to London to present the Constitution to the British Parliament. On July 9, 1900, Queen Victoria signed the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act into law. The 6 rival colonies were officially set to become one. The date was set for the very first day of the new century, January 1, 1901. On New Year's Day, 1901, under a brilliant summer sky, hundreds of thousands of people poured into Centennial Park in Sydney to watch their nation be born. A massive procession snaked through the city streets, a river of elaborate floats, military uniforms, and cheering citizens. It was a day of incredible optimism and national pride. In a special pavilion built for the occasion, the formalities took place. The first Governor-General, Lord Hopetoun, swore in Australia's first Prime Minister, the Australian Constitution, the result of a decade of struggle and compromise, was now the law of the land. The 6 colonies were gone. In their place were the states of the Commonwealth of Australia. A new nation had been declared. A sign strung across the Sydney Arch captured the hope of the day. One people, one destiny. The change was immediate and huge. The new federal parliament meeting for the first time in Melbourne in May 1901 had massive new powers. It could make laws for the whole country on big issues like defense, immigration, and foreign policy. And crucially, the economic walls that had divided the continent were finally torn down. Section 92 of the Constitution guaranteed that trade between the states shall be absolutely free. The tariff walls came down, creating a single Australian market. The era of economic rivalry was over. A high court was set up to interpret the Constitution, and the search for a new national capital began. The machinery of a national government was slowly grinding into gear. For many it felt like the triumphant end of a long journey. But this story of unity has a dark and complicated side. The decision to create a nation was also a decision about who belonged in it and who didn't. That vision of one people, one destiny was never meant to be inclusive. For many of its architects, federation was a chance to build a racially exclusive society. In fact, one of the main arguments for a national government had been the need for a uniform, restrictive immigration policy. This ambition was put into action with chilling speed. One of the very first laws passed by the new parliament in 1901 was the Immigration Restriction Act. This act created something called the dictation test. To enter Australia, a migrant could be forced to write out a 50-word passage in any European language an immigration officer chose. It was a deliberately cruel trick. If you spoke English, they could test you in Italian. If you spoke German, they could test you in French. It was designed to be impossible to pass and was used to block non-white migrants, especially from Asia and the Pacific Islands. This was the foundation of the White Australia policy, a set of racist policies that would define Australian society for the next 70 years. Even more profound was the silence at the very heart of the new constitution. In the decade of debates and votes, one group was almost completely missing from the conversation. The continent's first peoples, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, who had lived on and governed this land for millennia, were not consulted, not included, and not recognized in the nation's founding document. Worse than being ignored, they were deliberately written out. The new constitution contained 2 sections that revealed the racist attitudes of the time. Section 127 stated that when counting the population of the new nation, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. And Section 51 gave the new federal parliament the power to make special laws for the people of any race, except the Aboriginal race. This left Aboriginal affairs in the hands of the states, which continued policies of segregation, control, and dispossession. Aboriginal people were denied the vote in federal elections, shut out from social security like a pension, and had their movements and even their right to marry controlled by state governments. The creation of Australia, celebrated as a great leap forward in self-governance, marked a new chapter of injustice for its indigenous population. Their sovereignty was ignored, their rights were denied, and their very existence was erased from the national census. Federation wasn't just a single event, it was the start of a deep and ongoing transformation. It solved the practical, frustrating problems of the 19th century colonies. The trains could eventually run on the same tracks, goods could cross the country, tax-free, and a unified nation could stand on the world stage. It gave political shape to a growing sense of a shared Australian identity and laid the foundation for the independent, prosperous nation we see today. But the unity it created was incomplete and came at a terrible price. The ideal of one people was built on the deliberate exclusion of others. The White Australia policy, made possible by the new federal government, cemented racial discrimination into the core of the nation's identity, and the total failure to recognize or include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples created a legacy of injustice that Australia is still grappling with more than a century later. The birth of modern Australia on January 1, 1901, was a moment of both triumph and tragedy. It was the moment 6 bickering colonies finally became a family buta. The decision to federate changed Australia's history forever, creating the nation we know today while also embedding challenges and contradictions that continue to define its journey towards a more perfect and more inclusive union. The story of federation is a defining moment in Australian history, but it's just one piece of a much larger story. To learn more about the key figures and events from this era, we highly recommend checking out the websites of the National Museum of Australia and the Parliamentary Education Office. What part of this story surprised you the most? The train gauges, the tariff wars, or the complex legacy of the Constitution? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into Australia's past valuable, please consider subscribing for more stories about the events that shaped our world.